Around the world at any given time, some 3 million people who have not been convicted of anything are also behind bars, still waiting for their date before a judge. I talked about this issue with Martin Schoenteich, senior legal officer at the National Criminal Justice Reform.
Not only are the numbers very large, but in quite a number of countries, the length or the duration of pretrial detention is fairly significant. Research, for example, done in a number of European countries a couple of years ago, found that the average duration of pretrial detention there is some 6 months. And that's probably a fairly modest average. There are certainly other parts of the world, in Africa and Latin America, where the average duration of pretrial detention is probably much longer than that.
What kind of impact does it have not only on the alleged offender, but also on the greater society?
It has quite a significant impact. So as in most prisons, especially in prisons where resources are inadequate, infectious diseases are fairly widespread. And these not only affect the detainees themselves, but once they are released or once they interact with families or friends who come and visit them, those diseases are passed on to the larger community, creating a real public health hazard in some countries where pretrial detention is used rather excessively. There's also a financial cost. Anybody who's detained awaiting trial obviously cannot work, cannot earn an income, and that has a very direct impact on their household. Their minor children, aged parents, spouses of detainees suffer financially as a consequence. Not only is income foregone, but very often families have to provide funds to pay for a lawyer, to pay for a bribe in some cases, and to pay for other incidental expenses, traveling to the detention center, providing food and clothing for detainees, in many places where the state simply doesn't provide for these kinds of costs and expenses.
Well, critics will say that holding people suspected of crimes is essential to maintaining lawful societies. Do you agree with that?
Up to a point, and there are, in fact, a number of international and regional standards which provide guidelines as to when somebody should be considered for pretrial detention by courts around the world. So, for example, if there's a credible risk that a defendant will abscond or not stand trial, or interfere with the investigation, or there's a risk that he or she might commit a serious crime should he be released awaiting trial, and the court determines that there's no alternative other than pretrial detention to mitigate that risk, then pretrial detention is justifiable and is appropriate to be used. The problem is that pretrial detention is very often used so excessively and so arbitrarily that in many cases, even majority of pretrial detainees do not fall within these circumscribed boundaries.
Well, you mentioned we've been talking about excessive pretrial detention, but what about these long prison sentences for relatively minor crimes? The problems just really compound. So how should the prison system be changed around the world?
Prisons around the world are, as it is, overcrowded. Around the world, some 10 million people, a bit over 10 million people are imprisoned. And yet, officially, there's only prison space around the world for some 8.5 million people. So there are 1.5 million people too many. But of course, the overcrowding is disproportionately focused in certain places and countries, so that overcrowding is rather acute in these places. It's really up to the courts, the court systems, policymakers who change the laws or legislate the laws to begin to make a shift so as to reduce the excessive use of very draconian punishments and custodial sentences for persons who've very often been arrested and convicted of relatively minor crimes.
All right, Martin Schoenteich, thank you so much for joining us from Johannesburg.
My pleasure.